Welcome to our webinar on sustainable sourcing of global agricultural raw materials. This project is being undertaken by the Agricultural Sustainability Institute, also known as ASI, at the University of California, Davis, in collaboration with the Information Center for the Environment, also known as ICE, also at UC Davis. This webinar is going to be presented by myself, Sonia Brodt. I'm Academic Coordinator with ASI, as well as Tom Tomage, Professor at UC Davis and Director of ASI. And we'd like to acknowledge the generous funding that makes this project possible from Mars Incorporated. So to go into the structure of this webinar, I'll start by presenting you with the project purpose, and I'll tell you a little bit about the different individuals and entities that are participants on the project. And then Tom Tomage will take over with an overview of the more specific features and outline of the work to date on the project. So the fundamental purpose of this project is to assist food companies as well as other stakeholders in global food and agricultural systems by creating scientifically validated frameworks and a platform to advance sustainability in agricultural sourcing decisions, so that when companies are making decisions about agricultural commodity purchases, they will have resources to help them to understand how those purchases affect the long-term sustainability of agricultural production and supply chains. So what do we mean by sustainability? We're drawing from the Brundtland Report. There's a pretty well-known definition there about sustainable development, which is considered to be development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And for the purposes of a project like this, you could substitute in agriculture or even sourcing for the word development to similar effect. So this definition has some interesting and very useful concepts in it relating to needs of the present, which could be needs of companies for commodities that they have to have in order to make the products they want to make, or it could also be the needs of smallholder producers for sustainable livelihoods. And the second half of the definition talks about future generations, which suggests the need for conserving both human and natural resources. But what this definition doesn't do is provide a clear idea of how to operationalize these ideas. So let me go into that in a little more detail with an example from Mars. And this graphic, in fact, is available on Mars's website. So Mars has looked into their environmental footprint for their facilities, and they actually found that their direct facilities, for example, their pet food factories or their candy bar factories, only produce a very small percentage of the total greenhouse gas emissions part of their footprint. So as shown in the Scope 1 emissions, which is the on-site emissions in this diagram. And they found that a much larger, or actually the bulk of the emissions, comes from sourcing of agricultural products, both the production of those products and the shipping and supply chains of those products. That's really where their biggest impacts are. And so while it's one thing to lower the environmental impact of a relatively well-controlled, finite operation like their food factories, it's quite another thing to try to improve the sustainability in a much more complicated realm of these far-flung agricultural production systems and supply chains that span around the globe. And yet, making these kind of improvements to the larger supply chains is exactly what companies like Mars are trying to do now and are needing assistance with. And this is where our project comes into the picture. So looking at our project outcomes, we took the needs of these companies, and we kept the needs of these companies in mind and formulated these outcomes accordingly. So first, what we want to do is collect a large number of, we are in the process of collecting and collating a large amount of already existing data on sustainability. For example, we have information on specific topic areas or issues such as biodiversity and human rights and so on. We have information on indicators that can be used with these different topic areas. We have information on strategies or concrete actions that different entities can use to advance sustainability. And we also are collecting a lot of geospatial data sets that can support the analysis of all these issues, indicators, and strategies across the globe. And we're in the process of putting all of this information into a network database, as well as creating a scientific platform that will allow users to go in and efficiently find information for specific decisions. So, for example, somebody could go in and perform a query to, say, find everything on the socioeconomic factors and corresponding indicators that need to be taken into account when purchasing cacao from West Africa, or maybe rice from the U.S. South. So, in other words, our system is going to parse through a huge ocean of information and provide some filtering and assessment based on scientific credibility, and then organize this information according to the user's needs and help them to understand how to use these specific pieces of information for the decisions that they need to make for sourcing. So once we have these tools in place, our hope is to have food companies use and adapt to these decision tools to guide their raw material procurement decisions. And since everything will be open source, we also hope that the tools will be used by multiple stakeholders to forge new strategies for accelerating progress towards sustainability in supply chains. Now, we know that there are many different supply chain efforts, supply chain sustainability efforts going on throughout the food industry. Our project is not intended to compete with or displace these efforts. Instead, it offers certain complementary benefits that will support these other efforts and help users to make sense of all the different options out there. So for one thing, this project offers a unified suite of information on conceptual frameworks, sustainability issues, indicators, decision tools, and strategies, all under one roof, as it were, and all undergoing a degree of filtering or assessment based on scientific credibility. Second, this project is geared up to address issues that span across agricultural commodities on multiple geographic scales and also across different parts of the supply chain. So it's not just focused on one type of crop or one area of the world. Third, the information that will be found in our database will be framed according to distinct frameworks or conceptual approaches that each address distinct sustainability challenges in sourcing decisions. And Tom is going to go more into these details on the frameworks in just a few minutes. Finally, this project will make all of the information and decision tools transparent in their documentation and available not just to industry users, but also to the general public. In other words, it occupies a pre-competitive space in the industry. So by doing so, it has the potential to drive breakthrough improvements by fostering public sector, private sector, and NGO collaboration in defining new strategies for sustainability. Now I'm going to go into explaining some more about the various project participants. And we choose our participants on the understanding that collaborative efforts are usually more likely to lead to credible, useful, and legitimate outputs. So in our internal UC Davis team, we have 3 project leaders, myself and Tom Tomich, already introduced, as well as Jim Quinn, who's the director of the Information Center for the Environment. We also have been fortunate to assemble a very strong team of people with diverse talents, with expertise in key areas ranging from agroecology to international agricultural development, natural resource conservation, corporate sustainability initiatives, and also information management expertise such as geographic information systems and database management. In addition, we have an external technical advisory committee that brings in additional expertise in relevant areas. So this list includes several distinguished faculty in areas such as sustainable agricultural systems and agroecology, as well as senior leaders in international agricultural research centers associated with the CGIAR system. And they cover areas including institutional economics, land tenure and property rights issues, and public policy. And finally, we are in the midst of planning a multi-stakeholder engagement process, beginning with an initial group of stakeholders who represent those entities that are most directly involved in and are most directly affected by corporate sourcing decisions on the one hand, and on the other hand, we're also including some information management expertise, since that will be a key element of our project. We've been aiming for breadth of representation across the globe, and we're looking for stakeholders who are open to a range of possibilities in terms of designing sustainability strategies. So at the top, you can see our corporate partners, including Mars, and so there's food companies and a Tier 1 supplier, Bunge. Next, in green, we have our information management experts, including IBM, Esri, that does geographic information systems, and Maplecroft, that works on supply chain risk assessment. In gray, we have producers. Currently, both of the ones listed are from the U.S., but we're working on expanding this list to also include some from other countries, especially from less industrialized economies. In blue, we have NGOs who represent environmental interests and also social interests such as poverty in the case of Oxfam and grassroots farmers in the case of Imaflora. And finally, in light blue at the bottom, we have representatives of policy shapers such as government agencies and also global development and conservation funders. We do hope to expand this list as the project progresses, and in due course, we plan to design mechanisms for wider input from any number of organizations and individuals who may also have a stake in the results of this project.
So this is Tom Tomich here. Thanks very much, Sonia. I'll take this forward with an overview of where we stand with the project right now, and also use that to give some more depth in terms of the meaning of terminology, like conceptual frameworks. We have a very specific notion of issues, indicators, and also strategies for sustainable sourcing that are the key to understanding how the project works. Just to give a bit of an update of where we are, we've completed phase 1 of the project, which ran through the first half of 2012. There was scoping of the frameworks and perspectives that went into those frameworks that I'll be talking about in just a moment. Creation of an integrated list of sustainability issues, so that's kind of the kitchen sink of all the issues you could imagine. And at the same time, as a byproduct of that inventory of issues, we've also developed a prototype database of indicators that are relevant to those issues. We're right in the middle of phase 2, which runs until the end of the calendar year 2012, and we are taking to the next step, beginning the focusing process on both core issues and indicators within each of the 2 frameworks we're using. And this is where stakeholder engagement is so crucial. We have, as you'll see in a moment, cast the net very widely, and we want to work with stakeholders from the various perspectives that Sonia just described to help us make informed choices. Have there been key omissions in those lists? And are there, even more important, are there ways that we can consolidate some of the issues in areas where there might be similar indicators, for example, across issues? Looking to the new year, January 2013, there's a further 6 months of the project currently planned that involves identification and assessment of strategies. And we'll begin that discussion of strategies with the meeting we're convening in December in Washington, D.C. And at the same time, building on that meeting, further development of tools and moving into communication and project findings. So this is a graphic that we have used often, and I will be taking you step by step through the structure of the project using this graphic. It combines both big picture top-down assessment from the global perspective, but we also want to balance that with more of a grassroots perspective through Livelihoods. Bring all those things together. The idea that we don't really have a universal theory of what sustainability is or what the issues are. So this is an area where we've put a lot of energy, a lot of minds have come to bear in saying, well, what from different perspectives are the issues that people say are important? And then on this slide, you'll see the two diamonds, one called Impact Mitigation Framework and the other called Vulnerability Resilience Framework. Those are the two perspectives that we're using, the frameworks that we're using to really operationalize the concept of sustainability for raw material sourcing. And I'll give examples of what we mean by those terms in slides that are coming. In each case, there can be specific issues for each framework, specific indicators that relate to those issues within frameworks, and even specific strategies and modes of addressing the issues within the two different frameworks. So let's look at the three different perspectives that we've employed: global initiatives, corporate initiatives, and the livelihoods literature. So these are, if you will, the propellers of this. And you can see I'm going to be talking in turn about the global initiatives, corporate sustainability communications, and the livelihood literature. Let me just unpack that a little bit for you. So here's a list of the 15 global initiatives that our team has looked at. Things like the International Assessment of Agricultural Knowledge, Science and Technology, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, World Economic Forum's contribution, and others. I won't read them all out. But the approach really was to conduct a review to pick up the issues that are considered in each of these initiatives. And this is a key element that ties across all of the work, is to use a controlled vocabulary for the meaning of those issues so that when we're looking at global initiatives, corporate reports, or the livelihoods literature, we can make sense out of issues that are mentioned in different ways and categorize them appropriately. So on the corporate side, these are the 10 companies, the 10 of the biggest international food companies that we've looked at systematically reviewing their corporate sustainability reports. This includes Mars, but also 9 other major players. And then finally, a slightly different take is the livelihood framework. And we felt this was very important, particularly if we look ahead to strategies and actions. Those are going to have credibility, usefulness, and legitimacy at the grassroots level, so at the farm level, the village level. And we were afraid that just the international assessments and the corporate reports would not have an adequate grassroots perspective. So this literature really is about conceptualizing those perspectives from the grassroots. There are a dozen different conceptual frameworks that we've selected. And we call these collectively livelihoods, but I wanted just to make the point that these really bring together three closely related literatures. One is referred to as sustainable livelihoods. One is called the food systems literature, and the third part is called the food security literature, and you can see the specific citations there. So, given those three propellers, what were the issues that came out of this? And we call these integrated issues in the sense that using that controlled vocabulary, this is the long list of issues that are covered from these three different perspectives. And here it is, 43 different issues that are mentioned often multiple times in these different sources. Now, we've drawn from the livelihoods literature also to organize these a bit, the idea of 6 different kinds of capital: social and political capital, human capital, physical and financial capital, and natural capital. A couple of things about these different categories. They're certainly not hard and fast categories, but the human capital categories are almost always reported and measured in terms of individual outcomes, individual people. The social and political capital categories, in contrast, are usually about collectives, so villages, countries. Physical and financial capital tends to be measured in terms of dollars or a unit of currency. And then natural capital probably is among the better understood. Those are the natural resources that are the systems that are the foundations for life on Earth. Now, one other feature of this is that they're not perfect substitutes for each other. So, for example, financial capital, it cannot just buy new species. So what we have done is to consider these different categories, in this case 4 different categories, independently to make sure that we're drawing both issues and indicators in a balanced way from the social and political perspective, from the human perspective, physical and financial perspective, and the perspective of nature. So this is the long list. Don't be overwhelmed. We're going to be focusing it. So we use 2 conceptual frameworks to focus these lists of issues and to essentially filter them. And as I'm going to explain, each really addresses distinct challenges in sustainability from the perspective of raw material sourcing. We refer to one as the impact or mitigation framework and the other as the vulnerability or resilience framework. So recall the propeller diagram. We've now got our 43 issues, and we're going to use those 2 frameworks to screen those issues for their relevance within each framework. But what do we mean by those frameworks? Let's take an example from the issue of air and climate. So what we mean by impact is really illustrated by the question, does this raw material sourcing decision affect greenhouse gas emissions? And if so, is the impact positive or negative? So here the question is really about a specific purchase, a boatload of cocoa from West Africa. So the causal relationship is really running from raw material sourcing to its impact on the environment or on society. Now, the twin of impact is mitigation. How could raw material sourcing reduce greenhouse gas emissions or increase carbon sequestration? And the reason they're combined is, in this case, the mitigation suggests an area of strategies or approaches to address those impacts. Now, let's switch to vulnerability and resilience. The vulnerability question in the climate example is raw material sourcing exposed and sensitive to climate change? And the resilience counterpart to that is, how could responses to climate change contribute to greater adaptive capacity or flexibility in raw material sourcing? So you see, in each case, there's a question about an effect. And in the vulnerability context, the effect really runs from global systems, local environment, local society, two either open or foreclose options for raw material sourcing. But the other dimension of this is that vulnerability as an effect is also twinned with resilience, which would suggest a number of strategies to reduce vulnerability in parallel to the way that mitigation strategies would reduce negative impacts. So that's how those four keywords fit together. But let's dig a little deeper on examples to illustrate the importance of multiple issues. One, taken from right here in California, where we're speaking to you from, is that our very intensive agriculture in the Central Valley of California, while it produces in very high productivity systems an abundance of food and other agricultural products, that intensity of production also produces pollution, both of the air in the form of ammonia, but also pollution of groundwater in the form of nitrates that originate from agricultural activities. So the point here is understanding trade-offs between good things about agricultural and food production and negative side effects like air pollution and water pollution requires an integrated way to look at the full range of good and bad effects. So that's on the impact side. Let's talk about a vulnerability example and the challenge of reducing vulnerability. One of the great challenges of the 21st century is likely to be freshwater scarcity, in part driven by climate change. And I think it's very easy to understand how agricultural raw material supply chains are exposed and sensitive to water scarcity from whatever cause. If we were to talk about a resilience counterpart to that vulnerability, one example might be a strategy that focused on development of drought-tolerant rice to make the supply chain for rice more resilient to water scarcity. Let's go back now to the big picture after having talked about those examples and talk about how we've used these concepts to filter that long list of the integrated list of issues. So we're back in the middle. We had an integrated issue list of 43, and by applying the questions that I'm going to be talking about in a second, and I've already suggested in the examples, we've filtered that list of 43 down to 22 within the impact mitigation framework, and on the vulnerability and resilience framework, that filtering has produced an initial long list for our discussion of 30. And there are different elements on each list. It's not that the impact mitigation framework is just a subset of the vulnerability and resilience framework. They're rather different perspectives. So first, let's look at the impact side of the story. And here we applied specifically the question to those 43 integrated issues. Is it likely that agricultural raw material sourcing will have significant direct impacts on this issue? And we applied that to each of those 43. And here you'll see the list of issues from that list of 43 for which we felt the answer was yes. We don't think that this is the final list, and we're very much looking forward to working with partners on judging this about whether there are omissions or possible opportunities for consolidation. But you'll see that there are issues that have come up in each of those categories of capitals. And I won't go through each right now, but I will say in one example, for under human capital, the second on the list there, public health, has been one within our group. We've had some debate about whether the answer is yes, there are direct impacts of raw material sourcing on public health or not. So that's the kind of discussion we really want to have with our stakeholders. Let's switch to the vulnerability side. Again, here we've got a longer list, 30 core issues, and I emphasize once again, this is to start. So this is the straw person version that we want to add to subtract from, to deconstruct, to reconstruct in collaboration with partners. The question on vulnerability that we used to screen the list and filter them to this list of 30 was, is agricultural raw material sourcing significantly and directly sensitive and exposed to these issues? And one of the things that's striking about this is whereas the human capital and natural capital lists under vulnerability have some similarities to the impact side, what you see is a big increase both in the physical and financial capital categories and particularly in the social and political capital categories, which I think is very relevant to the discussion of strategies that we will have as well, because these are the questions of how do we actually enhance resilience, what are the things that we can do through partnerships to enhance sustainability. So I do, though, want to talk just a bit about the more technical question of indicator identification, because we view the appropriate identification of empirical indicators as useful both in focusing the list of issues, so it may allow us to give a finer empirical basis for making our issue selections, but also to guide strategy development. And just to take you through a bit, this is a snapshot of the protocol that our staff are working on indicator identification, typology, and assessment. As I mentioned, from our review of the issues that are listed in global initiatives, corporate reports, and the livelihood approach, we also generated as a byproduct of that a list of almost 2,000 different indicators that were used in those various sources. We are in the process of associating those indicators with specific issues using the controlled vocabulary that I talked about, and it may be that indicators are associated with multiple issues. Those are not viewed as a one-to-one. That process is ongoing. We're also sorting those by the two frameworks, and indicators can be useful in both, but we think that it's likely that indicators will be better suited to one or the other, either impact indicators or vulnerability indicators, or neither, and that's another source of distinguishing the two frameworks, and that process is ongoing. The indicators will be sorted by different applications, so different uses, say for monitoring states, trends, conditions in issues, monitoring thresholds, turning points, monitoring success in implementation of strategies. We're going to filter those because I think everybody will agree 2,000 plus is not a really workable list, really screening out some of the less credible indicators, and then each of the indicators that pass that first test of filtering will be assessed using criteria both for their usefulness and legitimacy. And if there's a need, and I think there will be, we will organize a separate webinar on this process so that those who want more detail can get the necessary background. Now, to end up on strategies, this is in many ways the so what. How can we reduce negative impacts? How can we reduce vulnerabilities guided by our understanding of these core issues? And we will begin this discussion in December with the meeting in Washington, D.C. However, I just wanted to give a bit of a toy illustration of how this might fit together. So if we were to take some of the core issues that have come up on the impact side, so air and climate issues, water, land and soil, income, nutritional status, there are a set of indicators that one might bring to bear. This is not the final list, but just for example, on air and climate issues like greenhouse gas emissions or changes in carbon stocks. On nutritional status, going to the bottom of the list, indicators like national food production or individual measures for children in which are called anthropometry. So these would be things like height for weight, height for age. Now, the strategic discussion starts to get really interesting because we can think about strategies that might be directed toward particular issues. Again, in the air and climate row, things like carbon taxes, cap and trade, various kinds of regulatory arrangements. But if you go down to the bottom row on nutritional status and over to the strategies, those are general components of broad-based rural development strategy. And notice for nutritional status, the strategic elements are also similar if you move up the line to income, similar sorts of strategies. So I do believe that there's scope, that there may be some unification across issues through what we can do about them. Finally, that right-hand side, the final blank column, indicators of success, we just wanted to flag that there are a separate set of performance indicators that would be used in the monitoring, evaluation, and assessment of impact of strategies that are likely to be very different from the indicators associated with the big picture issues. So, to wrap up, the benefits that we envision for this project are offering a suite of frameworks, issues, indicators, tools, and strategies for sustainable raw material sourcing. And I hope what we've been talking about has shed some helpful light on what we mean by those terms. Our intention is that these frameworks, issues, indicators, tools, and strategies will be applicable to any commodity on multiple scales and across the supply chain. We think that there is distinct value added to employing two frameworks, one on impact mitigation to consider the direct impacts of raw material sourcing on the environment and on society, as well as the reverse of that causality of being able to look out and say, how is raw material sourcing vulnerable to global change, regional change, local change, and how might there be effective strategies for increasing resilience of those systems? We are not in the business of creating new indicators and data sets. Our intention here is to enhance usefulness and access to multiple kinds of indicators and data. We want this platform to be fully public, to be transparent and open source, and in fact, those ingredients are a key part of its value. And we also, our ultimate aspiration is that this public, transparent, and open source process can drive breakthrough improvements through uncommon kinds of partnerships that bring together private companies, the public sector, and civil society, including NGOs, to really look at broad strategies that can be effective. And finally, we'll close. This is a picture of many of the members of our team, and this work was done being done as a collaborative effort. And in future webinars, you'll hear from other members of the team talking about their areas of work.
Thank you for your attention. This ends the webinar.
Thank you. Please stand by.